April 11th, 1955. A flight carrying journalists, delegates, and officials is en route to a conference in Jakarta, Indonesia. Exactly 5 hours into the flight, an explosion rocks the plane. The wings, engine, and baggage compartment are suddenly engulfed in flames. The electrical communication systems in the plane go dead, and the plane plummets into the ocean below. All 16 passengers were killed. 3 crewmen survived the ordeal and gave their stories as to what happened that day on the plane. But the real story is who wasn't on it. Today, on Unblurring the Unknown, we dive into a story full of cover-up, an attempted assassination, the vanishing and reappearance of the Chinese premier, and the reported involvement of the CIA in a murder plot during the height of the Cold War. They were flying in an Air India Lockheed L-749, a plane that is now known as the Kashmir Princess. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. I am your host, Dominic, and first and foremost, I want to thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. I want to apologize in advance if I sound a little bit stuffy. Kind of caught this weird bug that's seemingly going around again, so I do want to apologize in advance for that. So today's topic is a kind of conspiracy topic, and even though some parts of this story are confirmed to have happened, many questions remained unanswered about this incident, and today hopefully I will do my very best job at laying out all the facts for you, so that at the very end we can see who was responsible for the bombing of the Kashmir Princess, and subsequent motives for the bodies that be who were possibly responsible for it. So how today's episode is going to go, obviously I'm going to break down the story of the Kashmir Princess, what happened on April 11th, 1955. I might go into a little history of this kind of region of China and Taiwan and the Asian countries surrounding it, because that plays a big role into the story, as well as world tensions during that time. And if you say, well, Dominic, I don't want to listen to a whole history lesson, and I don't want to do that. Just tell me the conspiracy mumbo-jumbo and get on with it. Well, guess what? I gotta tell you this because it plays into the conspiracy. I can't tell you the conspiracy without supplying the history behind the conspiracy. So, with that being said, I'm going to go through all that, and then I'm going to sum it up at the very end with theories on who I possibly think are responsible, and obviously the conspiracy that surrounds this event. Now, let's waste no time, and let's get into the story of what happened to the Kashmir Princess. Now, like I said, let's get into what happened to the plane, its very valuable passenger that never made it on board, and the subsequent investigations into why the Chinese premier skipped the flight and who was responsible, and that this entire conspiracy was possibly done by the United States. Now let's get into it. On April 11th, 1955, Air India Flight 300, nicknamed Kashmir Princess, left Hong Kong, China, en route to Jakarta, Indonesia. At 4:25 Greenwich Mean Time, the flight was filled with journalists, delegates, and other government personnel headed for the Bandung Conference. Before the plane took off from Hong Kong, an Air India official personally accompanied all 37 pieces of luggage from the Chinese travel service to the airplane before takeoff. And because of the nature of the flight, the passengers themselves were able to bypass customs and were personally driven to the aircraft. That being said, all non-essential personnel were not allowed near the aircraft, and no mail or additional freight was being carried by the aircraft. Now, with that being said, the Chinese police and the Air India personnel took extra precautions to make sure that no harm came to the delegates on board of the aircraft, and to make sure no unwanted items were smuggled on board. It's important to note, the Hong Kong government was not prepared for any attempt to sabotage the plane. The airplane took off without incident from the Kai Tak airport and took off for the conference. The airplane's high-priority passenger, Chinese Premier Zhao Enlai, was not on the flight because of an emergency surgery he got done. But Keep this in mind, as we will go over this later. 5 hours into the flight with no issue, the plane was flying at an altitude of 18,000 feet in Indonesian airspace, when suddenly the plane was rocked by an explosion. Fire engulfed the area behind the third engine on the right wing. The fire quickly spread to the hydraulic system and the entirety of the undercarriage. Captain D.K. Jatar braced the plane and crew for an emergency water landing with the hope of landing easy enough to deploy life rafts. The pilot sent distress calls before the plane went down. However, smoke quickly filled the cabin, and when the plane made contact with the water, the electronic systems failed. The starboard wing of the plane hit the water first, which caused the plane to break into 3 separate pieces: the tail section, the passenger bay, and then the cockpit. The passenger bay sank pretty much immediately upon contact with the water, killing the passengers on board. The plane went down near the Natuna Islands, approximately 108 miles north of Kuching, Malaysia. The only 3 survivors of the crash were crew that were either in the tail section or cockpit of the plane. The pilot, D.K. Jatar, did not survive the crash. Now, Indonesian authorities located the aircraft, and the 3 survivors of the crash went on to give extremely detailed and identical accounts of how the plane went down. As it turns out, the high-priority passenger, Zhao Enlai, still made it to Jakarta for the conference 3 days later, which seemingly casts doubts on the idea that he had emergency surgery prior to the flight and that the surgery was faked. So does that mean that the plane going down, the Kashmir Princess, does that mean that this was no accident? And that Zhao Enlai knew there was going to be an assassination attempt made on him if he boarded the Kashmir Princess? Possibly, but we'll get back to this. A subsequent investigation into the crash started, and within a few months, they had answers into what happened on the plane. Now, the investigators found out that an explosion happened right next to the wheel well of the plane, and that in turn ignited the fires in the baggage compartment and the right wing. Initially, investigators thought that a bomb could have been mixed in with the passenger bags when they were loaded onto the aircraft. However, this seemed unlikely. Air India and Chinese police checked all bags before being loaded onto the aircraft, and they most certainly would have seen a bomb. The passengers on board were all delegates and journalists, who themselves wouldn't set a bomb in the plane. At least you would think so. This likely sent investigators down the path of thinking that this was a possible assassination attempt on Zhao Enlai. But who would do something like this? Now, to fully understand who might be responsible for the assassination attempt on Zhao Enlai, it's important to know about the climate the world was in, and the relations going on in the world, especially during this time period. Now, there is no doubt that during 1955, like I mentioned, world relations were not good at all. This was during the Cold War, and China's government had actually just switched from power. In 1949, the Chinese Nationalist Party, aka the Kuomintang, suffered a defeat in the Chinese Civil War at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. At this point in time, the Kuomintang oversaw rule in much of mainland China and was a nationalist group, and oversaw China as a republic. Now, there were times during the Kuomintang's control of the Chinese government that certain individuals tried to resort to the imperial dynasty of before, but it did not work out very well in that individual's favor. Now, after the Kuomintang got defeated by the Chinese Communist Party at the hands of their leader Mao Zedong, he took control over most of China and the territories that the Kuomintang oversaw. Whereas the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan and oversaw authority there. So obviously, with China now being communist-led, it was very easy to get caught up with their superpower next door in the USSR. Now, the USSR, obviously Russia, if you don't know what the USSR, Russia and the United States were beefing during the Cold War, and many countries were influenced by others to obviously pick a side, whether you were on the favor of the communist parties of Russia or whether you were in favor of the democratic policies of the United States. A lot of countries were very pressured into picking a side. In the beginning of the Cold War, China allied itself with Russia, and because of this, the Nationalist Party being kicked out, it would be realistic to think that this left a bad taste in the mouth of the United States. Now, Zhao Enlai just happened to have the second most powerful position in China at this time, and he was the primary aide to Mao Zedong during his reign in China as leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, it's important to note that after the Korean War, the area that would become Taiwan was under U.S. treaty and protection. Taiwan, now controlled by the Kuomintang, was concerned that they would lose their spot within the UN because of China now being run by the Chinese Communist Party. Another knowledge nugget to go along with this is that during this time, Hong Kong, where the plane originally left from, was under British sovereignty, and therefore the colony of the British, where it being a colony of the British, meant that Hong Kong was capitalist. Even after the Chinese Communist Party's victory in the Chinese Civil War and Mao Zedong taking power, Hong Kong remained capitalist. So it kind of seemed like an area where a lot of global conflicts became very personal, being you have this capitalist center in the middle of all this area that's communist. So also during this time, because of Britain having a colony, so to speak, in Hong Kong, the Chinese and the British were getting a little close, and obviously Britain being a very important factor in the UN at this time, that also meant Kuomintang in Taiwan was very concerned that they would lose their UN seat, and China would settle any disagreements they had with the UK, and it would basically mean that Taiwan would have no authority, no ruling power whatsoever, and this obviously frightened them to a great deal. Now, while the British had met with Zhou Enlai many times after the CCP's upheaval of the Kuomintang, the US did not like this at all. Great Britain was an ally to the United States, so they kind of just let it slide, even though the US hated it. Obviously, in the beginning of the Cold War, the United States hated all forms of communism, so the idea of their closest neighbor, or maybe not closest neighbor, but a very close ally, starting to become friends with the Chinese was something that they absolutely despised. The US was obviously against communism in any form, so with any attempts made by Zhou Enlai, most notably in 1954, when then US Secretary of State refused to shake Zhou Enlai's hand at a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, basically signifying the idea that the United States was not very happy with the CCP now taking control of China, and the CCP was like, hey, let's be friends, kind of like, oh, we're communists, but I want to try and be civil enough with you. And the United States is like, yeah, you're communist, we don't want anything to do with you. And why is this whole knowledge nugget important about US and global relations and Soviet Union and communism and capitalism and Cold War? It's important to know that there was a lot of political buildup in the world during this time and what the world was going through, as it plays a huge part into the conspiracy of this whole event. Now, motives as into why the assassination attempt was even made on Zhou Enlai in the first place. After investigation into the plane's explosion, it seems more likely than not Kuomintang were up to this for the assassination attempt on Zhou Enlai. The Kuomintang had a lot of motive to do it, and it only made sense. The Kuomintang did not want Zhou Enlai attempting to communicate with the US, who was Taiwan's main backer at the time, or Zhou Enlai getting Taiwan replaced at the UN. If it all went well at the Bangdun conference, with the Chinese making a hard push towards peace in the regions following the war, it would put the nationalists of Kuomintang in a very even worse situation than they already were. Now, like I said, it was determined fairly quickly that this was an assassination attempt and no accident. It was fairly certain that the Kuomintang did this, and Zhou Enlai traveling through British-controlled Hong Kong before hopping on the Kashmir Princess allowed them easy access into the city. However, what the Kuomintang wasn't able to account for was Zhou Enlai not being on the plane. Now, the People's Republic of China, aka the Chinese Communist Party, knew all the way back in March that the Kuomintang would make an attempt to sabotage their delegates going to the Bandung conference. However, they did not know how Kuomintang was going to do that. They had an idea that there might be some form of retaliation against delegates or even government officials going to the conference, but they didn't know in what shape that was going to happen. Now, the day prior to the Kashmir Princess taking off, so April 10th, the Chinese in Hong Kong communicated to the British Embassy that they did not know the details of the plot that was going to be made towards the delegates. However, what they left out was a knowledge of them possibly knowing that there would be an attempt to blow up the Kashmir Princess. This is important to note because I'll go over this in theories as to why I think this is bad. The Chinese didn't say that they knew the details of the plot that was going to be made, but they didn't say what they did know and what they felt like they were going to know is that the Kuomintang was going to sabotage the Kashmir Princess. They did not tell the British this. Now, like I said, the Chinese knew this, and they didn't let Zhao go on the plane, or the vice premier, Chen Li. But instead, they let other lesser delegates and journalists go in their place, knowing they would most likely never make it to the conference. Now, even though that is super fucked up, there are other theories as to why Zhao didn't go on the flight, and that the knowledge of what the Chinese knew of the plot was exaggerated. And I don't feel that way. I feel like governments know usually a lot more what they're willing to tell the public, and I think this was very well the case. That the Chinese found out and they got Zhao to Jakarta by other means. Now, I could keep going with the suspects and so on and so forth. However, the one I think that adds to the conspiracy is the case against Chao Se-ming. Now, Chao Se-ming was working at the Kai-Tak airport as a janitor. Now, of course, Chao Se-ming is an alias, and this man went by two other aliases as well. However, in the days leading up to the bombing, he was spending a lot of money around Hong Kong, and this raised some red flags. In the days prior to that, spending all the money around Hong Kong raised some red flags, like I said, and then right after the bombing, he disappeared from Hong Kong. Now, his location and where he disappeared to was that he hopped on board a civil air transport plane to Taiwan, which adds credit to the idea that he was a member of Kuomintang and that he placed the bomb on the plane and was fleeing from Taiwan to avoid prosecution from Chinese authorities. Now, this is where everything gets fun. The Civil Air Transport Service was frequently used by the CIA as a contract air carrier, which means they used the CAT for a variety of transport needs that benefited American interests, more or less. Now, because of this, this is where the big conspiracy starts. Even though the evidence points towards this being a Taiwan plot of them attempting to assassinate Zhao Enlai, the fact that Chao Se-ming used CAT to escape the country shines a light on the idea that this was a plot from both the United States government and Taiwan to assassinate Zhao Enlai and throw the Chinese Communist Party into a frenzy right after they took control of China. To add some evidence to this idea, while investigating, Indonesian investigators found in the wreckage an American-made Mk7 detonator device. Now, it's almost certain that the United States supplied these detonators to the Kuomintang in Taiwan. However, that's not the smoking gun or foolproof evidence that the United States had a role in this, because of course it is not uncommon for countries to exchange goods, or for Taiwan to even purchase them from the US, rather than the US government give them to Taiwan to carry out an assassination plot. In the years that followed the event, there was still skepticism whether or not the US was involved. The Chinese asked the President Nixon-run White House at the time if the CIA or American government had any role in the bombing of the Kashmir Princess. In response to the second request the Chinese sent over to the American government, Henry Kissinger, who served as a national security advisor during the Nixon presidency, replied to the Chinese and told them that they thought too highly of the CIA's abilities to even carry something like this out, quietly dismissing the idea that the US was involved at all. Now, it's important to note, and I'm going to add this little nugget before we get into theories, that Henry Kissinger basically saying that, oh, you think the CIA is, this uber talented organization that can carry out all this stuff, they're really just stupid. Well, it's important to note that the CIA is not stupid. The American government is not stupid. And Henry Kissinger using the idea that, oh, the CIA is stupid, they wouldn't do something like that, or they don't have the abilities or resources to pull something like that off, is completely not true. Because later during the Cold War, the CIA used the Contras and guerrilla fighters in Central America to help root out the communism. Obviously, during the Cold War, Fidel Castro controlled Cuba, communism being right next to America, and then communism slowly taking over Central America. The US hated that. So obviously they supplied Contra fighters and guerrilla fighters with weapons and American services and goods to overthrow communist governments, and this was very planned out and this was orchestrated. However, it did not go the way that they wanted it to. This was still very planned out and orchestrated. Like, the CIA is not stupid. So it goes back to the idea that Henry Kissinger basically saying that, oh, I think you drastically overestimate the abilities of the CIA, is a complete farce. But that's neither here nor there. Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we roll into the theories section. Now, with that being said, here are some of the top theories that I possibly think this could be. Now, the first theory being is that this was strictly Taiwan, or the Kuomintang. Now, like I mentioned before, Taiwan and the Kuomintang had all the reason in the world to attempt an assassination on Zhou Enlai. This makes a whole lot of sense for them to do it. Obviously, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to kill all of the innocent passengers on board, but it makes a lot of sense for Taiwan to attempt something like this. I mean, they just got beaten in the Chinese Civil War just a few years prior. This makes a heck of a lot of sense. So with that being said, I feel like that is the most popular theory out there, is that this is Taiwan. I think mainstream media has come to the conclusion that they feel like it was Taiwan. But this is, again, where the second theory comes in, is that the United States had a hand in the assassination plot. Now, again, this is also very likely because Chiao Sei-ming used the civil air transport to flee Hong Kong and go to Taiwan to avoid prosecution from Chinese authorities or even British authorities. And knowing that civil air transport was used by the CIA and was under contract by the CIA adds to the idea that the U.S. helped. Do I necessarily think that the U.S. supplied the bomb to Chiao Sei-ming or any other operative who could have placed a bomb on the plane? I'm not sure if I want to go that far, but I wouldn't throw it out of the realm of possibility for them to say, hey, if you do this, if you plant the bomb on the plane, we will get you out of the country. I don't think that that's very far-fetched. But the idea of an American agent in Hong Kong placing the bomb on the plane, so if it wasn't Chiao Sei-ming, the idea of an American agent placing a bomb under the wheel well of the plane as an American is very, very risky, because if the United States got caught with this attempt, this would thoroughly sever world relations with a lot of different countries. So I don't think the U.S. would physically put their fingerprints on it, even if you could kind of suspect that they did it, but if there was no evidence to say that they did it, they would kind of say, oh no, we didn't do that. Like the shit still stinks. Like, it still stinks now, but it's not enough to say, oh yeah, the United States did it, we're going to take responsibility. I don't think that was the case. I think that they were very, very specific and very particular, if the U.S. was involved, on how they wanted to execute this, how they wanted to get it done. Obviously, the United States, during this time period, hated everything communist. So I would not put this past the U.S. government to an attempt something like this, or work with Taiwan, or work with the Kuomintang to do something of this sort and help in some way or fashion. Now, the third theory I have is a little bit more interesting. And this theory, and I kind of went out on a limb here, and there's a few holes in this theory, of course, but I just wanted to get everybody's brain thinking that this could possibly be something as well. As when I was doing all my research, I honestly didn't find this as a theory, so I thought that this would be kind of a cool one to think about. Is that maybe this entire thing was a frame job by the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party. Now kind of let that stew and marinate for a second. The Chinese knew that there was a strong chance that the Kashmir Princess or an attempt of life on Zhou Enlai would happen. So, obviously they didn't tell the British that there was going to be a bomb on the plane, or that they knew that there was probably going to be a bomb on the plane. So obviously we know that they were not telling the British everything that the British probably should have known, with it being a British colony in Hong Kong. So the Chinese staged the bombing and got Zhou Enlai to the conference by other means. Obviously, they would not assassinate their second in charge to their leader, Mao Zedong, but they could possibly stage the bombing and act like this was an assassination attempt on Zhou Enlai, and basically say, oh, Zhou Enlai didn't go on the plane because he had emergency surgery. Now, obviously, they got Zhou Enlai to the conference, as that was a very important conference. And, I mean, for instance, if the world believed that Kuomintang was responsible, it would further make them, Taiwan, the Kuomintang, and Chinese nationalists pretty much, it would make them look like the bad guys in the eyes of the UN. And if we know the history of the Chinese Communist Party, I don't think it is a stretch of the imagination to say that they would be willing to spend 16 lives on advancing their new government and their new empire. It's something to think about, and it's a very high chance that they could have done it. Obviously, the CCP are not good guys. They were never good guys. You can go up and look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Not good. Not good. Not great. So, that could basically entertain the idea that this was a frame job by the Chinese government used to pretty much point fingers at Taiwan and say, hey, they did it. However, this would not cover the evidence that the Indonesian investigators found the MK7 detonator device, and you would think that there would be some more information out there if it was a possible Chinese cover-up. So, do I necessarily believe this theory? Maybe not entirely, but it is something interesting to think about when you start laying out all these theories as to assassination attempts and whether or not the US was responsible and so on and so forth. I just think it's very entertaining to think about. So with that being said, I think, when it's all said and done, I think that the United States had a hand in the assassination plot. That's what my theory is. I'm going to go with that. Like I mentioned before, I don't know if the US was responsible for planting the bomb on the plane, so to speak, but I definitely think they helped get Chow Sei-ming, or whoever was responsible for the bombing, out of China and back to Taiwan, or even back to any other safe haven across the world. I don't think that that's very far-fetched, and I don't think that that's unreasonable to think. Obviously, the US, if they wanted to help plan something, and they wanted to help organize something of this extent, they would be very, very careful, like I mentioned, in how to do this. They would not want to compromise their world relations, especially with Great Britain controlling Hong Kong and so on and so forth. But it would realistically make sense. They already had a little bit of spite towards the British because they were starting to get a little buddy-buddy with China, so I guess it would kind of make sense. But again, if the world powers that be discovered that the United States attempted an assassination attempt on the leader of a world superpower, that wouldn't go over great, especially in the eyes of the UN, so it's a whole powder keg if you want to think about it. And like I mentioned before, I think Henry Kissinger saying that the CIA is too dumb to carry out something like this is a complete farce, like I mentioned. So, with that being said, I genuinely think the U.S. had a hand in the assassination plot. Do I think the U.S. is a sole party responsible? No, I don't. I think they had to be way too careful about this, and I don't think them themselves would do it. However, if Taiwan and the Kuomintang approached the United States and said, hey, we need help getting our operative out of Hong Kong after he plants the bomb on the plane, you can do that. And the U.S. probably said, yeah, we can do that, but we're not going to help you. But what they didn't expect is that the Chinese would figure it out and not put Zhou Enlai on the plane. And that's pretty much probably when their plan, with lack of a better word, and I'm sorry for the pun, blew up in their face. So that, I think, is the theory I'm going to go with. With that being said, this is kind of a light conspiracy theory, as the conspiracy theory really just dictates around the idea that this was the U.S., the conspiracy theory being that the U.S. had a role in this, although that is never confirmed, and we're probably never going to know whether or not the U.S. had a hand in this, as, for obvious reasons, we're never going to know. But, with that being said, I had a heck of a lot of fun researching this topic. This is really the first conspiracy theory type of episode that I've covered, even though this is kind of a conspiracy theory really rooted in facts, in history, and stuff like that. And I had a heck of a time with it. And let me know if you want me to do more episodes like this. I probably will, just because of how much fun I had with this. Really, I never got bored researching it, not like I usually do, but I never got bored researching it, and it was something I was always like, oh, now I feel like I'm kind of unraveling more of the pieces of the puzzle, sort of speak. But with that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. Like I said, if you like this kind of conspiracy theory idea that I went down for this week, please let me know. Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the YouTube comments. Let me know under the Instagram post that I share out for this episode. If you were unfamiliar with that concept, on Instagram, and that's going to be at Unblurring the Unknown, I share all pictures and photos relevant to this week's episode on my Instagram, so feel free to head over there to check them out. I try to get them up the day of, however, my schedule's been so crazy with the holidays and everything, I haven't been able to stay on top of it like I normally do, so I want to apologize for that. And if you are listening to this on Spotify, make sure that you turn on notifications so you get notified every time a new episode publishes. And if you are listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe to my YouTube. Same thing happens. You will get notified every time I post a new episode. And please, if you're listening to it on Spotify, go subscribe to me on YouTube too. It does me a huge favor. And if you're on YouTube and you have Spotify, do the same thing on Spotify. Do the vice versa. It helps me out a lot. I really appreciate it. It helps me get my content and this content out there. And I really hope you're enjoying it, because I'm having a heck of a lot of fun doing these episodes. And I'm not quite sure what's the angle I want to go for next week. Obviously, next week is next Monday, Tuesday. I mean, that's Christmas. So I might take a week off, might not. I'll kind of play it by ear. But with that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode. Again, thank you very much. And if you have any topic suggestions you want to send me, or if you want me to do more of cryptids, or more of aliens, or more of conspiracy theories, feel free to shoot your topics to my email. That is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. I'll say it again, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. Thank you very much for tuning into this week, and I will see you on the next one.